This is the Nikon Z 100-400mm f4.5 to 5.6 lens for Z mount cameras like the Z9, the Z7 II. That's the camera I was testing this out with. Nikon were kind enough to send us one so we could check this out with a hands-on review and to see how it handles. Now, primarily a 100-400 is probably going to be used for things like wildlife, bird photography, sport photography. It's kind of perfect for that, but 100-400mm focal range does lend itself really well to all kinds of things. It's a very versatile focal range. So I shot a little bit of landscape as well, but you could do all kinds of things with a lens like this. Now, the first thing that really occurred to me when taking this lens out of the box was that it's pretty comparable in size and weight to the 70-200 f2.8, and that's quite a nice thing. You know, it fits well in a bag, it's not too ridiculously big. I didn't feel like I was taking out some huge lens with me while I was out and about, and I was able to handhold every shot that I took, which I always really like. It is 1.4 kilos, or about 1.4 kilograms, so it's a little bit heavy, but it's certainly easy enough to handhold it. So like I say, my primary thing that I was testing out was wildlife photography, because it feels like that's a prime use for a lens like this. So I was out shooting birds, squirrels, really anything that I could find, really testing that autofocus out, tracking, and the image quality as well. And I've got to say, this lens is a very, very nice lens to use. I didn't really have to think too much about the autofocus. I was using the Z7 II, so not even the Z9, which would probably be my camera of choice with this lens. But even with the Z7 II, the autofocus was working extremely well. I was very, very happy with the colors, the contrast, the kind of image quality that I was getting from the lens. And the bokeh itself was also very, very beautiful. Now there's 9 diaphragm blades here, so you get nice smooth bokeh. Also got 25 elements in 20 groups, and the image quality is not a concern in the slightest. It looks really, really beautiful. Now I tested that bokeh with kind of isolating some flowers and things like that to really see how smooth it was. I couldn't see any artifacts, I couldn't see any kind of horrible, you know, when you get that swirly, strange kind of bokeh, nothing like that. It all looked very, very nice. And just to take it back to the autofocus for a second, it was very, very reliable. I actually ended up just not thinking about the autofocus at all. I would either let the camera decide, or I'd select a focus point and the camera would quite happily just track objects like birds flying through the air, squirrels moving fast. Absolutely not a problem. It seems like for wildlife, for sports, this will be an absolutely ideal choice for that kind of thing. Now you've also got 5.5 stops of vibration reduction, which is basically like image stabilization, which is a really useful thing to have in a lens like this. Now, of course, when you're shooting fast moving objects, you're still going to want to use a nice fast shutter speed, but if you're not shooting such fast moving objects, this does allow you to bring that shutter speed down without having to worry about handshake or lens shake or anything like that. You're still going to get a nice sharp image. And of course, this also works really well for video. So if you're shooting video, you could absolutely shoot handheld with this lens and not have too much of an issue. You could shoot, you know, whether you're shooting sport or wildlife still in video. This is just going to help you if you are shooting completely handheld, which of course means you don't have to take as much kit out with you. f4.5 to 5.6 isn't obviously the fastest, but it isn't too bad at all. So in terms of low light shooting, you can still get a decent amount here. And of course, cameras like the Z7 II, the Z9, whatever you might be using with a lens like this, they're very capable of stepping up that ISO if you need to. Now, I mentioned that the lens is about 1.4 kilograms, so it's a little bit on the heavier side, but it's not that much of a big deal, to be honest. It's not so heavy that I find myself having an issue with it carrying it around shooting handheld. I was out and about for probably about 4 or 5 hours on the longest shoot with this lens, walking around, carrying it handheld, carrying it in my bag, and it was never really a problem for me. It feels like a solid, well-made bit of kit, and that really extends through the whole lens. So for example, it is an external zoom, but it doesn't go out too far, and I never had any problem with lens creep when I was actually hanging the lens down. The zoom ring is nicely weighted, so it's not going to turn unless you are actually trying to turn it, and it feels good in the hands as well. Same with the manual focus ring, which, while you're probably not going to use manual focus very often, on the odd occasion that you might, and I actually did, just to test out what it feels like, it does feel nice as well. You've got several function buttons on the lens that you can set up for different things, and while I don't tend to actually take advantage of those, it's a nice thing to have on there that you could actually set a different function easily reachable on the lens. You've also got this OLED display that shows focal length, which is a nice touch, and I quite like the kind of look of it, although realistically it's probably not overly useful in any particular way. But I think from a design standpoint, it looks quite nice on the lens. lens. In terms of other controls, you've got switches for focus distance. You've also got auto and manual focus switch as well. There's no switch to turn on or off the vibration reduction, essentially the image stabilization, which means you have to control that from within the camera. Now, for the most part, I would probably never need to turn that off on this particular lens. The only situation where maybe you turn it off is if you've got it locked off on a tripod and you're actually just shooting pretty much a static composition or something where there's not loads of movement going on. And realistically, I just can't see myself needing to turn off. But if you do need to, that is going to have to be in the camera. Not the end of the world, but maybe it would have been nice to have a switch on the lens for those of us who would want to turn it off. Ultimately, this is a great addition to this range of lenses. Image quality wise, it is beautiful. Autofocus works really well on there as well. In fact, it's good enough, the autofocus, that, like I said before, I just stopped thinking about it, which is ideal in a situation like this. It means that you can rely on it in those moments when you need it most, which is probably the most important thing about an autofocus system with a lens like this. I like the design, I like the size. It might be a little bit heavy for some people, but it is a 100 to 400mm lens. You know, there's only a certain limit as to how light this could be, and you kind of want a lens of this kind of focal range to have a little bit of weight to it. So I don't mind that at all. I think 1.4 kilos, I think that's absolutely fine, and it actually feels good. It's certainly hand-holdable. It's a good, solid lens. For wildlife photographers and sport photographers, this is a great option. I think it's a very, very nice zoom lens to add to a collection, to an arsenal of lenses, and I think it's gonna be very, very useful for those kinds of photographers, as well as other types of photography as well. If you want to check out the full spec and all the pricing and all that kind of stuff of this lens, you can check out the link down in the description. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe as well, because there's new videos all the time. I'll be seeing you in the next video, but until then, as always, thanks for watching.